Some companies spit out one innovative product after another, changing the world and achieving astronomical company valuations. Other companies, on the other hand, fail to innovate and quickly become yesterday's news. In this video, I'll introduce you to 7 of the most important biases and fallacies that affect managers and companies and repeatedly cause their innovation efforts to fail, thereby sending their companies into a downward spiral. Hi, I'm Felix, and in this video you'll learn how to avoid the common thinking errors that prevent successful innovation. Number 1. Which do you think is worse? 2 hikers are on a glacier hike and one falls into a crevice. The other hiker just watches, doesn't help his companion, and leaves her to die. Or one hiker intentionally pushes her companion into a crevice to kill her. Of course, both acts are incredibly cruel, but still, most people would classify the second act as comparatively worse, even though the result is the same. The reason for this is the omission bias. We value active actions differently than non-actions. As early as the 1970s, BMW developed the 1602E, an electric car, which, however, could not compete with the gasoline cars of its time. The German carmaker, however, had 4 decades to bring the technology to market maturity in order to become the world's first mover in electric mobility. Instead, the company spent 40 years doing happy engineering and kept developing new concept cars in small runs for motor shows, until it finally put the first electric car on the road on a large scale in 2013, 5 years after Tesla released the Tesla Roadster. Many companies consider it more risky to dare something than doing nothing, but it is often the other way around. If you risk nothing, you end up risking everything. How can you avoid the omission bias? Don't wait to see how the world changes. Instead, make small bets on the future and think about how to commercially launch an innovation today, even it may only be possible in a small but already profitable niche at the beginning. Number 2. Have you ever noticed that a goalie very rarely stays just in the center during a penalty shootout? The urge to jump to either side of the goal is just too great. The omission bias is reversed here, as the norm is reversed. Since jumping is the norm, goalies find it extremely difficult to stay in the center of the goal. This is especially interesting since an incentive to stop a penalty kick is extremely high for a professional goalie, and statistically he would have the highest probability of stopping a penalty kick if he stayed right in the center. Statistically speaking, staying in the center has a 1/3 probability of success, while jumping to either side has only a less than 15% chance of success. That's right, the goalkeeper actually doesn't have to do much to maximize his chances of success. Nevertheless, he jumps every time again. It's the same with companies when innovating is the new norm in their industry. Now that everyone is suddenly working on the new, everything has to happen very quickly. The phenomenon behind this is called action bias. My tip to avoid the action bias: instead of focusing too much on what others are doing in your industry, come up with your own vision and strategy based on your inherent strength. Number 3. Have you ever bought movie tickets, plopped down in the theater with a big box of popcorn, only to realize after 30 minutes that you don't like the movie at all? Even if your companion feels the same way, it is extremely difficult to admit this and leave the cinema. This phenomenon is commonly referred as the sunk cost fallacy. We have already invested a lot of time and money. That's why it's even harder for us to admit the mistake and minimize the cost. Because with every additional minute we spend watching the movie, our costs actually continue to rise. When Apple launched the Apple Newton in the 1990s, it quickly became clear that the revolutionary handheld device was a flop. But it wasn't until the company's founder Steve Jobs, who had previously been forced out of the company, returned to Apple to take over the business in 1997, that the loss-making product was taken out of the range. Jobs, on the other hand, found the decision easy, as it was his predecessor's pet project. My tip for innovators: practice doing the right thing on a small scale. For example, at your next movie night. Yes, your friends will probably hate you for it. For innovation projects, every once in a while ask yourself, would I continue to invest in this project if it were someone else's project? Number 4. In 1979, researchers at Stanford University conducted an experiment. They gave study participants 2 different studies on the topic of death penalty. Both studies were faked. The first study showed data suggesting that death penalty reduces crime. The second study showed data suggesting that the death penalty has no significant effect on crime. The study participants who previously stated that they favored death penalty unconditionally believed the first study, but were very skeptical of the second study's data that did not match their beliefs. Conversely, the same was true for the opponents of death penalty. This was exactly what the researchers had expected. What surprised them, however, was that after reading both studies, both groups were even more convinced of their previously held opinions, even though they were looking at the exact same data. This phenomenon is known as confirmation bias, and although it is very well studied, it is very difficult to avoid. When we have an idea for a new product, service, or company, we are usually convinced that this is a good idea. Consequently, we believe all the information that shows that our idea is good and are skeptical of anything that contradicts our conviction. How can you avoid this bias? When you do surveys, you should pay most attention to all the data that does not correspond to your own convictions. Number 5. Researchers conducted an experiment in which participants had to make origami figures. Afterwards, the participants were asked to indicate how much they were willing to pay for the creations, both their own and those of others. The result was that the participants were particularly willing to pay a lot for their own creations. They found their amateurish figures just as valuable as the figures of real professionals. You turn out so beautiful, my little bird. The more work we put into something, the higher is the value for us. When we develop a new idea, we also develop psychological ownership. Our own ideas always have a higher value than the ideas of others. When managers are tasked with implementing a creative idea that they did not develop themselves, the later such a project handover takes place, the lower the psychological ownership. The later the handover, the less creative the implementation of the idea. My tip for innovators: involve the people who are important in the implementation phase as early as possible in the project. And whenever possible, the same person who initiated an innovation project should be allowed to implement the idea. Number 6. Every day there are dozens of predictions about when we all be living in virtual reality, flying to Mars, or commuting to work in self-driving cars. No one knows for sure, which is why predictions, especially the bold ones, are so exciting. The only problem is that hardly anyone checks to see if the predictions have proven themselves in 5 or 10 years, let alone that anyone who has made a wrong prediction would have to pay a fine. You're under arrest! You lied to us about vegan cheese melting on pizza! The problem is forecast illusion. Many technologies, such as digital photography, have also developed exponentially. First, we have an extremely poor intuition for exponential growth. See my video on how to improve your intuition in this regard. Second, small variations in the growth factor have serious implications for the forecast. In retrospect, on the other hand, development is always easy to calculate. In short, it is extremely difficult to make a valid prediction about the future. How can you mitigate the bias? Always think of forecast only as possible scenarios and consider what each scenario would mean for you or your industry. Number 7. Have you ever thought about how much time you need for a project and then realized that you actually need much longer? And probably this didn't happen to you only once, but happens to you almost every day. We humans are usually very optimistic in our planning, no matter how many times the past proved us wrong. Innovation projects are often valued by applying the discounted cash flow method. This involves developing assumptions about future revenues and growth rates. These assumptions are very much subject to the wishful thinking fallacy. To reduce this fallacy, one usually develops various scenarios, including a worst-case scenario. In this, one tries to calculate with very conservative and cautious assumptions. The problem is that one usually also develops a best-case and mid-case scenario, which have strong anchor effects. The more optimistic the other scenarios, the better the worst-case scenario turns out. Things can still get worse than worst case. In other words, even the worst-case scenario is heavily influenced by wishful thinking. How can you prevent wishful thinking? The best way is to consciously encourage yourself and your team to think about possible mistakes and setbacks and to plan time for dealing with those. These were the 7 of the biggest biases that cause innovation projects to fail. If you're interested in the psychology of innovation, please subscribe to my channel. What biases did I forget to include in this list? And what flawed thinking is preventing innovation in your company? Let me know in the comments, and I see you in the next video.